Next up, we have Neuren Pharmaceuticals. Neuren has an ASX code of NEU and has a market cap of around $1.65 billion. Neuren is developing therapies for neurodevelopmental disorders that emerge in early childhood that have no or limited approved treatment options. Presenting for the company today is Jon Pilcher. Jon, thank you for your time. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Abby. Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate you dialing in to listen to the Neuren story. Thank you. Next slide, please. So before I start, I always have to just point out there's some forward-looking statements in the slides and in my comments that subject to risks that could lead to different outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me just start by telling you about, I guess, Neuren's mission. Why do we exist? And we exist to try and do something about neurodevelopmental disorders. So these are serious neurological disorders, emerge in early childhood. They're called syndromes after the names of the people who discovered them. So across the top of the slide there, you can see the names of the syndromes, starting with Rett syndrome. Underneath there, you can see the genetic abnormality that causes them. So you can see they're all caused by completely different genetic mutations on different chromosomes. And yet, when you look at the kids clinically, they all look very similar. And very sadly, it's a terribly debilitating wide range of issues affecting just about every aspect of life. So walking, talking, breathing, sleeping, eating, hand use, cognitive function, everything impacted. There are no treatments approved other than our treatment for Rett syndrome, which I'll come on to in a minute. Fortunately, they're not degenerative. So typically, the kids will live into adulthood. But that just means, a lifelong, huge burden on both the patients and their families. So that's what we're trying to do something about. And we are not trying to treat the genetic mutation. We're trying to treat something downstream of that, which is common to all of these, which is that when the brain's developing, the sort of branch-like connections between the neurons don't form properly, and therefore signaling is not happening properly in the brain, and that governs just about everything in your body. And that's why you get this wide range of impacts. So that's what we're trying to do something about. And so therefore, we're trying to treat the syndrome. We're not trying to treat one of these particular symptoms. So we have two drugs. They are both delivered as oral liquid formulations. So twice a day drink, which is a great dose form for these kids. Next slide, please. So this is our pipeline at the moment of our products. So two drugs at the top of the slide there. Trofinetide is the sort of chemical name for the drug. It's called Daybue in the market, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then NNZ-2591 is the second drug. So the first drug is partnered with a NASDAQ-listed company, Acadia Pharmaceuticals, and they are currently marketing Daybue, which I'll talk about in detail in a minute. The second drug, NNZ-2591, we own that outright. We've just got positive phase 2 results across 3 different syndromes, which again, I'll cover in a minute. One thing to understand about all of these syndromes, these indications, is that they are so-called orphan drug indications. And that means a few things. One, much more favorable pricing than you get with mass market drugs. Secondly, the regulators give you additional protection against generics on top of the patents that you have. And thirdly, you get a much more favorable run through the regulators. So you typically don't have to do all of the trials, and certainly not to the same size as you would for a mass market drug. So we think that orphan drug model is very attractive for a company like ourselves, and it just means that Neuren's whole business is 2 things: neurodevelopmental disorders and orphan drug indications. Next slide, please. So from an investor point of view, it's pretty simple, really. There are 3 things that drive our value. The first thing is our share of Daybue in the US for Rett syndrome through our agreement with Acadia. The second thing is our share of that same drug in Rett syndrome outside the US. So we've done 2 different deals with Acadia, which I'll talk about in a minute, and we get a share of the value of both of them. Then the third thing is the second drug, NNZ-2591, big value upside from taking that through development. So as you go through development of a drug, the value increases very significantly as the risk falls away as you get closer to the market. And I think the beauty of this position we've got is that, often with biotech companies, you might be investing on a binary outcome, which, it's effectively all or nothing. Well, in our case, that's not what this is, because you've got the financial foundation of DEBUT, very significant cash flows coming to us. We've got cash of more than 213 million Australian dollars, with a lot of money coming in the future, which I'll show you in a minute. And that allows us to make the best decisions, to do the right thing with the second drug to maximize the value. We're not going to compromise anything due to financial constraints. And it also means we don't have to raise capital in order to realize that big value uplift from the second drug. So when you think about Neuren, you've just got to think about those three things, and I'll run through each of them briefly now. So next slide, please. So we'll start with DEBUT. So last year, it was approved by the FDA as the first ever treatment for Rett syndrome, and in fact, the first treatment for a neurodevelopmental disorder. So that was an incredibly proud moment for us after a long journey to get there. Acadia launched it in April last year. Fantastic start, $177 million of sales in a partial year last year, and they've guided to between 340 to 370 million of sales for this year. And just to point out that everything I talk about is calendar year, so Neuren's financial year is the calendar year too. And then what that translates into revenue for us, on the right-hand side here. So we had royalties of 27 million Australian dollars last year. That will grow under Acadia's guidance to 55 to 61 million this current year. But we also expect a milestone payment, which I'll highlight in a minute. So our total revenue this year should be between 132 and 138 million Australian dollars. We had a maiden profit last year of 153 million Australian dollars. So, this sort of revenue has enormous financial leverage for us. So that's the US, and just to point out that Acadia is now working to get approval in other jurisdictions. We're expecting a decision from Canada before the end of the year, hopefully approval. And then in the first quarter of next year, Acadia is planning to file the marketing application in Europe, and then they're working with the Japanese regulator to move that forward in that jurisdiction as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me just run through the economics of how this works for us and where those big cash flows come from. So two different deals with Acadia. The original one on the left-hand side in North America, which is effectively the US and Canada, and on the right-hand side outside North America. These two deals done at different stages. The North America deal was done at the end of phase 2, and the outside North America deal was done after approval in the US. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because that's an important thing to understand. So on the left-hand side, we've already received $60 million in milestone payments previously, but I think more importantly for investors now is what is the future. So at the bottom of the slide there, bottom left, our revenue comes in two forms: royalties, so we get between 10 and 15% of all sales. Currently, it's running between 10 and 12%. It's a tiered arrangement. And then on the right-hand side, that's supplemented by one-off sales milestone payments. So we expect to earn the first of those this year. So the first calendar year that sales exceed $250 million, which they will comfortably do this year, we'll get a one-off payment of $50 million from Acadia. So that will be in our revenue this year. We actually receive it in cash in the first quarter of next year, but it will be in our revenue this year. On the right-hand side, then outside North America, so we've already had $100 million up front last year. Big milestones coming on the first commercial sale in different jurisdictions, and then sales milestones, similar to the US arrangement. And royalties on all sales this time, mid-teens to low 20%. So again, point out the difference between these deals: 100 million upfront versus 10 million upfront, and mid-teens to low 20s royalties versus 10 to 15%. It just shows you the power of doing a deal at a later stage. It's only one example, but you get much better economics and you keep much more of the value if you can do a deal further down the track than we did with the first one. Next slide, please. All right, let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about the US launch of DAYBUE and the sales so far. So on this chart, the dark blue bars are the quarterly sales of DAYBUE. The grey bar is the quarterly sales of another orphan drug that launched about the same time, and it's a good comparator because the number of patients is very similar and the pricing is very similar. So it's actually a pretty good analog. And you'll see a few things. One is that DAYBUE has exceeded it in every quarter so far, but you'll also see a slightly different pattern rather than a sort of a linear growth. You see we had a massive surge in demand in Q3 and Q4 last year, so the second and third quarters after launch. And then we had a fall in sales from Q4 to Q1, and then it's resumed the growth journey. There were lots of reasons for that drop from Q4 to Q1. Our share price has been heavily impacted by that, by people with a short-term view about quarterly sales. My view is that's way overdone. You've seen that from the royalty point of view. We're exposed to effectively 10% of that difference. So it doesn't really impact us significantly from a value point of view. Obviously, it has hit sentiment, which has hit our share price, which is disappointing. But we're still very optimistic about the future for DAYBUE. It's a fantastic outcome so far. I mean, if you'd said that in the first year of sales, we're going to do more than 300 million, if you'd said that before launch, then that would have been way above everyone's expectations. So we've got 30% of the diagnosed patients have tried therapy. We've got 900 active patients on therapy as at August. Out of the 5,000 diagnosed patients, that's expected to grow to between 6,000 to 9,000 is the theoretical number of patients out there. Surveyed physicians have said their intention would be to increase prescription to 70% of their eligible patients. So that 30% of penetration, there's a lot of room for that to grow. This drug is very expensive, as all orphan drugs are. So it's not families who pay for it. It's Medicaid in the US that covers kids, and it's private health insurance plans. And Acadea's done a fantastic job getting more than 80% of the patients covered formally by either of those settings. And I think, and also what they're doing now is they've collected a lot of real world experience from what's happened since launch. So, at launch, you were telling the world about the clinical trial data, which is, endpoints that are quite hard for people to understand what they actually mean. Now they've got a lot of real world evidence of what are the positive things being seen by families from treatment. And that's much more powerful in now getting the word out to the rest of the market who've not tried the drug yet. So I think for us, growth in the US in the short term, and then with Canada, then Europe, then Japan coming on stream, there's a long-term growth story here. You've seen the economics that we get from it, and I think one thing I didn't mention is that we have no cost attached to those economics. So it all goes straight to pre-tax profit for us. So it has, again, massive financial leverage for us, which gives us such a strong foundation for the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've talked about the first two elements of the value drivers for the business. The third one is the second drug, in NZ-2591. We love this drug. It's got properties that we think make it extremely favourable. The dose we have to use is 1/20th of the dose that's required for trofinetide. The manufacturing position is much more favourable. We really think it has the ability to have an impact across multiple syndromes here. And so the whole strategy here is to push it in multiple syndromes in parallel. We didn't want this playing out sequentially over 10 years. We're trying to get the full impact of this drug as early as we can. So where we've got to is that through this year, we've had results from trials, phase 2 trials in 3 different indications: Phelan-McDermid, Pitt-Hopkins, and Angelman syndrome. They've all been positive. I'll show you some of that in a second. And then we're working on some other indications in the background that we think we have further opportunity in, and we'll talk about those in a few months' time. So the first cab off the rank is Phelan-McDermid syndrome. We've just met with the FDA last month to discuss the phase 3 program. So we were hoping that after our relatively small phase 2 trial, we would be able to move into a phase 3 trial. And indeed, that meeting has confirmed that we can. And better than that, it's really just repeating the phase 2 trial. So it's a 13-week study in the same dose as phase 2. It'll have endpoints that we used in phase 2. So really, we've just got to repeat what we've done in phase 2. So that's a great outcome. We're preparing for that trial at the moment. There's a huge amount of preparation that has to go into that. Manufacturing, identifying the trial sites, appointing the various service providers who assist you. So all of that's happening at the moment. There's one thing we've got to fix with the FDA, which is just to confirm the primary efficacy endpoints, either way you measure efficacy in that trial, and then we'll be ready to go. So that's really exciting for us. As I go back to when I said about the two different deal constructs, if you can take something to the end of phase 3, massively different value proposition. Many companies want drugs that are that close to sales, much more than when you're at the end of phase 2. So that's the goal, to really, for shareholders, capture the most value we possibly can out of this. Next slide, please. Okay, so just very quickly on the results of those 3 trials. There's a lot of numbers on this slide, so I'll just try and pick out the most important thing, and that is the percentage of patients that improved in these trials. So across all 3 trials, you got the physicians judging the patients, more than 80% of the patients and up to 89% improved, and the caregivers judging the improvement in between 2/3 and 83%. So that's a great outcome, and important to see the consistency between what the physicians thought was happening and what the caregivers thought was happening. They had a very consistent view. And then finally, at the bottom there just shows the things that drove the improvement. So improvements in communication, behavior, cognitive ability, motor ability, and social interaction. Very consistent across the indications, and really important things in these syndromes. So again, we think all of this has validated our view about this multi-indication strategy that we're pursuing. Next slide, please. Okay, I just want to show you some data from the Phelan-McDermid syndrome trial, which is, as I said, our first cab off the rank. So these charts, on the left-hand side, it's the physician's view of improvement, and on the right-hand side, it's the caregiver's view of improvement. You can see a sort of a white horizontal line on each chart that represents no change. So anything above that is improvement, and each bar is an individual patient. So from the physician's point of view, 16 out of 18 kids improved, 15 out of 18 from the caregiver's point of view, and we got 2 kids scored a 1, which is the very best score you can get, which is a wow result. It's quite unusual to get that. So again, when we first saw these results, we were blown away by them. Very exciting. Next slide, please. And just to explain, why is it important to do these multiple indications in parallel? Well, again, just pure numbers. On the right-hand side is the estimates from prevalent studies of the potential patients in the US in each of these. And even if you take the most conservative estimate, Phelan-McDermid is twice Rett syndrome, Pitt-Hopkins a little bit less than Rett syndrome, and Angelman a bit more than Rett syndrome. And you add them all up, it's 4 times Rett. So huge opportunity here compared with debuting, and a much, much bigger value opportunity if we can be successful here. And with the first 2 indications, Phelan-McDermid, Pitt-Hopkins, we're ahead of the game. We're the most advanced program. So we can get to market first, which is what Acadia has done with Rett, set the price and really dominate the market. That's the opportunity here. Next slide. Okay, so let me finish just on the key things to look out for. I mean, on the left-hand side, I won't run through all of this in detail, but we have had, a fantastic year from a milestone point of view. 3 positive results, a great meeting with the FDA, debut sales of 160 million in the first half, and then Canada and Europe moving towards, through that regulatory process. So fantastic year, but there's really important stuff coming up. So we need to just confirm that final alignment with the FDA on the primary efficacy assessments for that phase 3 trial. and then we can commence the phase 3 program in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. We're going to advance further indications beyond the 3 I've talked about. And then, of course, there's the debut royalties and sales. Acadia will do their next update in November, which will be on the Q3 sales. And at the moment, our expectations of Neuren's revenue for the year between 132 and 138 million. And then we've got potential approval in Canada, and then finally that European marketing application. So thank you. I will end there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jon. I appreciate there's a lot to get through there, so well done. So we do have a few questions for you. So firstly, could you talk about the estimated market size of your therapies? Which indications have the most commercial promise?
Yeah, so I think I just ran through that on that prevalence side. So we think, thank you. So as I said, if you take the most conservative estimate on the right-hand side, then Phelan-McDermid is twice Rett, and that's the biggest opportunity. Angelman syndrome, I'd say, is similar to Rett, and Pitt-Hopkins a little bit lower. So when you've seen the sort of sales we've got in Rett, more than 300 million a year already in the first full year of sales. So that's the benchmark, and we think that Phelan-McDermid syndrome, I think, is the biggest opportunity, but they're all very attractive opportunities. And the indications that we're working in the background are similar. So.
And then, Jon, what are the company's plans regarding the Angelman syndrome program? When can we expect indication of the phase 3 trial in Angelman syndrome, and which indications are being prioritized for NNZ-2591?
It's a good question. So Angelman syndrome, you can see on this slide, slightly different competitive position. We don't have the sort of the first mover advantage like we have in the other two. There are 2 RNA therapies, one commencing phase 3 before the end of the year, the other's going to be commencing phase 3 next year. But they're both delivered by spinal injections, and it's not just one injection, it's multiple injections, and a clinical trial that requires sham injections to be made where people are not receiving the drug. So it's a pretty tough clinical trial to be running. We have oral therapy, obviously we don't have that issue, and we can also take genetic all comers. So we have some real advantages, but before we're going to launch into phase 3 in Angelman, we need to be sure that that's enough. You don't want to run a phase 3 trial where your third choice, it's not going to work in this sort of population. So we're going to do some work within the community and also with the FDA to work out what a phase 3 could look like, and whether we feel confident to go in and compete head-to-head against those 2 companies. A lot of interest in Angelman from other companies. It's very well known, very high profile, so there's definitely value there. We're just going to work out how best to access that. So I can't give you any timelines on that at the moment. It's too early. As far as prioritizing, I mean, Phelan-McDermid is the top priority. We're moving as fast as possible with that, but we are hoping that Pitt-Hopkins will perhaps be 6 months behind that. And then, as I said, there are other indications we're working on, which I think have a lot of promise, and we'll talk about those in due course.
And then regarding undisclosed diseases being treated on mice in laboratory, assuming several good results, A, would you be confident of orphan designation? B, would you be inclined to go to phase 2 trial on these? C, how much approximately do 3 times phase 2 trials cost?
So yes, we are pursuing orphan indications. That remains our strategy. We think it's the right strategy. So yes, I would expect all of them to be eligible for orphan designation. I think, yes, we would likely want some sort of clinical proof of concept before launching into a phase 3 registration study. We would likely need that. Phase 2 studies, I mean, they're relatively low cost. I expect them to be less than $10 million each. That would be the sort of cost.
And then earlier in your presentation, you mentioned a competitor product. Is this alternate product significantly cheaper than debut, and will it reduce sales?
So there's no competitive product to debut. So, that it remains the only product on the market, and really there are some competing products in development, but they're quite a long way from market still. So there are two gene therapies. The companies are Taysha and Neurogene, for your information, that are developing gene therapies to try and treat Rett syndrome, but they're at early clinical stage. They would be a different pricing model. They would typically be usually with gene therapies, if they get to market, it's a very, very, very high price, but it's sort of a one-off price at the beginning. So time will tell. But importantly, I think the two approaches are complementary. They're completely different approaches, so there's no reason why you couldn't have a shot of gene therapy and then continue to have therapy with DABY. So.
And then also in the presentation, you noted that there's no approved treatment for PMS, PTHS, or AS. Could you comment on what sort of management is currently used in these cases?
Sure. So all of these disorders are similar, and Rett was the same. There's so many different symptoms, so many different things wrong, that they tend to be on a cocktail of drugs and therapies. So they might be on an anti-seizure medication, an anti-anxiety medication. They might be getting speech therapy, physical therapy, all sorts of other things. That's what tends to happen when there's no treatment specifically targeted for it.
And then what options are you considering for commercialization of NNZ-2591?
Yes, I think really there are three options. So when you get to the end of phase 3 and you've got a positive outcome, then there are three things you could do from then. You could either decide to commercialize it yourself. So what Acadia has done and the success they've had with Rett, their sales and marketing organization is approximately 50 people for that. They obviously have the sort of the backup of a commercial organization, but 50 people. So it's not impossible to think you could change the company to be a commercial company. I think if we can do that, though, that's a big change, and you'd move it to the US. So that's not our strategy at the moment, but it is an option for the future if shareholders wanted that. The other two possibilities are to do some sort of partnering deal at the end of phase 3, which would be radically different economics to the sort of economics you can get at the end of phase 2. So, and then that might be region by region. Or the third option is, many companies will get acquired at that point in time. That's often the time when a lot of companies want products that are near to sales, and you will often get acquisitions happening at that time. We're completely open to that outcome if that's the best option. So I think multiple options, which in this sector you want to keep multiple options as long as you can.
And last question from me, Jon. So are there any other neurodevelopmental disorders beyond those you're currently targeting for which you might consider developing treatments?
Yeah, absolutely. And we are doing work in non-human sort of models at the moment to try and give ourselves the confidence that, yes, we could do this. We think 2591 is applicable across many, many potentially. So we want to pick the best. I guess these three were our best initial target. We want to come up with our next shortlist, and we're not far away from that, but not quite ready to talk about it yet. But looking forward to that. We certainly want to make the absolute most of 2591. So,
Jon, thank you so much for your time. A really fascinating presentation. We'd love to get you back on the webinar in the new year. But I hope you have a great weekend, and thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Abby, and thanks to everyone for listening. Cheers.